December 1944. Ardennes, Belgium. A frozen, unforgiving landscape stretches as far as the eye can see, the snow crunching underfoot like brittle glass. Here, in this deadly winter theatre, the Third Reich's most fearsome creations sit idle. King Tigers, the 75-ton monsters of armoured warfare, glinting ominously in the pale winter sun. They are supposed to be invincible, unstoppable engines of death, commanded by men who have mastered the art of tank warfare. And yet, on this day, something extraordinary is about to unfold, because the real weapon that will stop them is not made of steel, not forged in some secret factory, and not carried by elite soldiers. It costs 50 cents, and it fits in the palm of a man's hand. A simple coil of rope, a few pounds of explosives, and a spark of ingenuity so audacious it defies logic. In the heart of the Ardennes, Lieutenant Colonel David Perrin and his men of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion are about to challenge the might of Nazi Germany in a way no one could have imagined. These are not battle-hardened killers. They are builders, engineers, men who fix bridges and clear rubble, yet faced with a column of Panther and King Tiger tanks barreling down frozen roads at terrifying speed, they will invent a weapon that will freeze the most disciplined soldiers of the Wehrmacht in their tracks. What could possibly make 5,000 of Germany's finest flee, leaving behind 135 armored beasts worth hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money? It isn't bombs. It isn't a surprise army. It isn't some miracle of technology. It's a single rope, a deadly trick, and the courage to wait for the perfect moment to strike. This is the story of the 50-cent weapon that destroyed 135 tanks. This is the story of ingenuity against brute force. This is how ordinary men turned the Battle of the Bulge into a nightmare the Germans would never forget. December 1944. Ardennes, Belgium. A frozen, unforgiving landscape stretches as far as the eye can see, the snow crunching underfoot like brittle glass. Here, in this deadly winter theatre, the Third Reich's most fearsome creations sit idle. King Tigers, the 75-ton monsters of armoured warfare, glinting ominously in the pale winter sun. They are supposed to be invincible, unstoppable engines of death, commanded by men who have mastered the art of tank warfare. And yet, on this day, something extraordinary is about to unfold, because the real weapon that will stop them is not made of steel, not forged in some secret factory, and not carried by elite soldiers. It costs 50 cents, and it fits in the palm of a man's hand. A simple coil of rope, a few pounds of explosives, and a spark of ingenuity so audacious it defies logic. In the heart of the Ardennes, Lieutenant Colonel David Perrin and his men of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion are about to challenge the might of Nazi Germany in a way no one could have imagined. These are not battle-hardened killers. They are builders, engineers, men who fix bridges and clear rubble. Yet, faced with a column of Panther and King Tiger tanks, barreling down frozen roads at terrifying speed, they will invent a weapon that will freeze the most disciplined soldiers of the Wehrmacht in their tracks. What could possibly make 5,000 of Germany's finest flee, leaving behind 135 armored beasts worth hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money? It isn't bombs. It isn't a surprise army. It isn't some miracle of technology. It's a single rope, a deadly trick, and the courage to wait for the perfect moment to strike. This is the story of the 50-cent weapon that destroyed 135 tanks. This is the story of ingenuity against brute force. This is how ordinary men turned the Battle of the Bulge into a nightmare the Germans would never forget. The idea of the daisy chain was deceptively simple, but turning it into a functioning weapon was anything but. Lieutenant Colonel Perrin's engineers began experimenting with the M1A1 anti-tank mines. Each mine was a heavy steel disc packed with 6 pounds of TNT, a weapon capable of shredding the tracks of a Panther or King Tiger. Alone, one mine could stop a tank, but precision was everything. The engineers needed more certainty. They tied 4 or 5 mines together with coils of rough hemp rope, looping the ends securely around the mine handles. Spaced about 5 feet apart, these chains could be dragged across the snow, concealed in ditches or behind rubble, invisible to German eyes. They called it the daisy chain, a deadly necklace of destruction. Practice sessions were grueling. The engineers had to master timing, distance, and coordination. Each man visualized the tank approaching, heart pounding, hands frozen to the rope. They would hide in foxholes, sometimes only 15 to 20 yards away from a 45-ton monster, waiting for the split second when the chain could be pulled under the tracks. Every trial was a test of nerve and endurance. One slip, one miscalculation, and the consequences were instantaneous. Yet they persisted, turning fear into meticulous preparation. Meanwhile, the German column advanced with confidence. The Panzer pioneers, trained to detect mines, walked ahead of the tanks with their metal detectors. Trusting their doctrine and technology, they swept the frozen roads with precision, certain the path was safe. Visibility was poor. Fog hung thick over the Ardennes, limiting sight to mere meters. The engineers' positions were concealed perfectly, hidden from the enemy's eyes. The Germans saw nothing unusual in the snow-covered ditches. Tension was unbearable. The first tank approached the carefully laid chain. The sergeant in the foxhole gripped the rope, knuckles white, adrenaline coursing through every vein. The engineers had rehearsed this moment countless times, but rehearsal could not replicate reality. The smell of exhaust, the ground trembling under tons of steel, the high-pitched whine of the Maybach engine growing louder with every heartbeat. The plan relied not just on explosives, but on psychology. The Germans trusted their equipment, their training, their superior technology. They had no reason to suspect that something as simple as a rope and a hidden chain of mines could halt their advance. And yet, as the engineers prepared, each passing second stretched the possibilities of disaster or triumph. Every glance at the approaching tanks, every shiver from the cold, reminded them of the stakes. Failure meant death. Success meant rewriting the rules of engagement. As the daisy chains were positioned concealed under snow and rubble, the engineers realized they were not just setting a trap, they were engaging in a silent duel with the most technologically advanced army in the world. The first strike would be decisive. The lead Panther, unaware of the deadly necklace awaiting it, inched forward along the narrow, icy road. The stage was set. The ingenuity of ordinary men was about to collide with the unstoppable might of Nazi Germany. The fog hung low over the Ardennes as the first Panther tank crested the frozen road. Its long 75mm gun prowled the horizon, the massive engine growling like a predator ready to strike. Behind it, the rest of the column followed in a seemingly endless chain of steel, armor, and menace. Hidden in a foxhole just yards away, Sergeant Harris gripped the rope of the daisy chain. His hands were numb, fingers almost frozen, yet he held on with everything he had, every S. Seconds stretched into an eternity, each vibration of the road a reminder of the approaching danger. The tank moved closer. 30 yards, 20 yards, 10 yards. The engineer's breath came in sharp clouds frozen in the frigid air. All rehearsals, all calculations, all preparation now depended on one precise moment. The sergeant waited, muscles tense, heart pounding louder than the roaring Maybach engine. Then, with a violent tug, the chain slid across the snow, striking directly under the Panther's tracks. The explosion was immediate. The sound was not just heard, it was felt, a punch to the chest that rattled bones and shattered nerves. Steel tracks twisted and tore apart. The lead tank lurched violently, skidding sideways across the narrow road. Inside, the crew was dazed, ears ringing, momentarily blinded by the shockwave. Outside, chaos erupted. And then it happened. The narrow roads of the Ardennes allowed no room for maneuver. The tanks behind the immobilized Panther slammed into each other, grinding to a halt. Trucks, fuel carriers, and armored vehicles piled up, a metallic traffic jam stretching for miles. What had started as a single explosion became a cascading disaster. Engineers, still frozen and trembling, watched as the psychological impact took hold. The Germans began to panic, each shadow now a potential trap, every pile of snow a threat. The first strike was just the beginning. Over the next hours, the daisy chain became more than a weapon, it became a nightmare. Phantom chains, empty ropes, even scraps of metal were dragged across roads, forcing German drivers to screech to a halt again and again. Exhausting fuel, time, and morale, the engineers exploited the enemy's fear, turning perception into power. Each immobilized tank amplified the terror of the next. What was once a disciplined, unstoppable column was now paralyzed, trapped in a web of American ingenuity. Meanwhile, the rest of the Allies waited. Fighter bombers circled above, the P-47 Thunderbolts ready to strike. The Germans, consumed by fear and confusion, became easy targets. The daisy chain had transformed a small, humble invention into a force multiplier. Ordinary engineers had immobilized the best tanks Germany had to offer, demonstrating that courage, creativity, and precise timing could triumph over raw power. By the end of the day, the damage was catastrophic. The German advance had ground to a halt, mission failure imminent. The first true victory of ingenuity over brute force had been won, not with massive firepower, not with elite soldiers, but with a 50-cent rope, a handful of mines, and men willing to risk everything for a single perfect moment. The Battle of the Bulge had always been about speed, momentum, and precision. Joachim Peiper had planned his armored column with military exactness, counting on discipline and superior technology to carry the day. But now, every calculation was thrown into chaos. The daisy chain had done more than stop tanks. It had shattered German confidence, turning routine procedure into a game of paranoia. Every shadow, every pile of snow, every discarded scrap of wood became a potential death trap. The psychological toll was immense. Lieutenant Colonel Perrin and his men were no longer just engineers, they were the orchestrators of a deadly theater, their traps dictating the movement of some of the most powerful machines ever built. Each rope pulled, each mine detonated, sent ripples of fear through the German ranks. The engineers refined their tactics, improvising as the enemy reacted. If a single chain could stop one Panther, multiple chains could halt an entire convoy. They experimented with timing, spacing, and placement, ensuring that no tank could move forward without risk. The Germans were meticulous. They had trained for this scenario, or so they thought. Panzer pioneers swept the roads, confident that their detectors would reveal any buried threat. But the frozen earth and cunning American ingenuity rendered their technology useless. The engineers exploited every weakness, hiding mines in ditches, behind rubble, and beneath the snow, always prepared to yank them under the lead vehicle at the perfect moment. The Germans advanced unaware that the most dangerous weapon was invisible until it struck. As the hours wore on, the daisy chain evolved from a physical tool into a psychological weapon. Engineers began dragging empty ropes across roads, or tying harmless objects to wires. The Germans could not distinguish real threats from illusions. They slowed their advance, uncertain of every step. Hours of hesitation compounded with the immobilized tanks, creating a bottleneck that stretched for miles. The column consumed fuel at an alarming rate, engines idling to prevent freezing, further reducing their chances of reaching the Meuse River on schedule. Allied intelligence observed the unfolding disaster with grim satisfaction. What should have been a lightning strike across the Ardennes was now a stationary trap, a mechanical and psychological nightmare. The engineers' bravery and quick thinking had not only stopped tanks, they had bought critical time. Every delayed hour allowed Allied forces to regroup, to deploy air support, and to exploit the paralysis of the German advance. By the evening, the consequences were clear. The Germans were trapped in a slow-motion disaster, forced to navigate a deadly obstacle course designed by men who, just days before, had only known the roar of bulldozers and the scrape of shovels. The 50-cent weapon, the humble daisy chain, had done what no tank, artillery, or airstrike could. It had turned arrogance into vulnerability, speed into stagnation, and fear into a weapon. The ingenuity, courage, and precision of the 291st Engineers had rewritten the rules of engagement. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, ordinary men had outsmarted the mightiest armored force on Earth, proving that in war, brains could triumph over brawn, and that even the smallest tool could have monumental consequences. As night fell over the Ardennes, the full impact of the engineers' actions became undeniable. The German advance, once a streamlined juggernaut of armored power, was now paralyzed. The lead Panther tanks lay sideways across narrow roads, King Tigers idled in frozen confusion, and fuel trucks strained under engines left running for hours. Time, the most precious commodity for Peiper's mission, had evaporated. Every second of delay meant that the plan to split the Allied forces was slipping further out of reach. The 50-cent weapon, the simple rope and chain of mines, had achieved what thousands of rounds of artillery or sophisticated weapons could not. It was not the largest or most powerful force on the battlefield that had won, but the smallest, simplest, and most cunning. The engineers' ingenuity had transformed ordinary tools into instruments of mass disruption. Each tank stopped was a domino, each frozen column a testament to the cleverness and courage of men who understood that war could be won not only with strength, but with intellect. The Germans, trapped in a nightmare of their own making, faced mounting frustration. Their Panzer pioneers, trained to detect mines, were now rendered ineffective by American improvisation. Every shadow, every snowdrift, every scrap of debris became a potential threat. Paranoia spread like wildfire. Even experienced officers second-guessed their movements, their confidence eroding with every false alarm, every explosion that jolted the lead tank. The psychological weight of the daisy chain revealed the physical damage it inflicted. By Christmas Eve, the situation reached its climax. Piper had no choice. Surrounded, out of fuel and pressed by time, he issued the order every tank commander dreads: abandon ship. Radios were destroyed, guns sabotaged, and 800 surviving soldiers slipped silently into the forest, their boots muffled with rags, retreating on foot through the snow. Behind them, 135 armored vehicles, Panthers and King Tigers alike, were left frozen in the Ardennes, monuments to a failed plan and a lesson in underestimating ingenuity. These machines alone could have outfitted 2 full armored divisions, yet they now sat abandoned, inert, and useless. The engineers of the 291st Combat Battalion had changed the course of the battle without firing a single shot from a rifle. Their daisy chain had forced the Germans to stop, think, and ultimately retreat, preserving lives and gaining a decisive advantage for the Allies. It was a clear demonstration that war is not solely won with superior firepower or technology, but with courage, creativity, and the willingness to act boldly in the face of overwhelming odds. In the aftermath, historians would reflect on the brilliance of this simple device. The daisy chain would become the grandfather of modern asymmetric warfare, a precursor to improvised explosive devices that continue to challenge armies worldwide. It was a reminder that even in the most technologically advanced conflicts, innovation and human daring could turn the tide. Lieutenant Colonel David Perrin and his men had beaten Goliath, not with a stone but with a rope, a chain of explosives, and the nerve to wait until the precise moment to strike. The 50-cent weapon had done what no one expected. It had immobilized Germany's finest, altered the course of a pivotal battle, and proven once again that ingenuity, courage, and timing can outweigh even the most formidable force on Earth. The morning after the initial chaos brought no relief for the Germans. The frozen Ardennes roads still held the remnants of the immobilized tanks, each Panther and King Tiger a reminder of the audacity of the Americans who had outsmarted them. Piper's column attempted to push forward again, but the daisy chain had already turned their advance into a slow-motion nightmare. Every attempt to move a tank forward was met with hesitation, uncertainty, and the ever-present fear that the next step could trigger another devastating explosion. Lieutenant Colonel Perrin's engineers had perfected their system. They had placed new chains along the routes, sometimes combining empty ropes with real mines, forcing German crews to question every inch of the road. The Panthers, engines still growling, were now slowed not just by physical barriers, but by a psychological grip that made each decision a gamble with life and death. Soldiers in the lead tanks glanced at their surroundings with suspicion, sweat freezing on their brows despite the bitter cold. Even the most experienced officers could not predict where the next strike would come. The ingenuity of the Americans turned the terrain itself into a weapon. Narrow roads became lethal corridors, frozen ditches hid chains that could be yanked into place in seconds. The engineers' movements were precise, their patience unwavering. One misstep could be fatal, yet every mine pulled under a tank reinforced the system, creating a cascade of immobilization that multiplied with every attempt by the Germans to advance. Air support now began to exploit the situation. Allied P-47 Thunderbolts, observing the halted column, struck with deadly precision. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and immobilized tanks became easy targets, their crews unable to move or respond effectively. The combination of fear, paralysis, and destruction compounded the Germans' losses. What had started as a single clever tactic had grown into a coordinated effort, blending ingenuity with opportunity, turning ordinary engineers into the architects of chaos. Meanwhile, the Germans' frustration reached a peak. Panic and anger replaced the calculated discipline that had carried them so far. Orders were given, then ignored, as confusion spread from the front to the rear of the column. Tanks attempted to maneuver around obstacles, only to become stuck or blocked by the tightly packed vehicles. Time slipped away, and with it, the possibility of reaching their objective. Piper's arrogance now worked against him. His plan, reliant on momentum and speed, had collapsed under the weight of ingenuity and persistence. By afternoon, the results were catastrophic. The German column was a tangled mess of armored steel, stopped engines, and frozen soldiers struggling against the cold. Every attempt to regain control ended in frustration or destruction. The engineers, concealed in the trees and behind walls, observed their work with grim satisfaction. Their simple 50-cent weapon had multiplied in effect, immobilizing hundreds of tons of advanced armor, draining the enemy's morale, and buying invaluable time for the Allies. The daisy chain had proven that a battle could be won not just through force, but through creativity, patience, and courage. The engineers' gamble had paid off spectacularly, transforming a humble invention into a decisive force that changed the course of the Ardennes offensive. Each explosion, each immobilized tank, each hesitant movement by the Germans was a victory of intellect over brute strength, of daring over fear. By now, the German soldiers were trapped in a nightmare of their own making. Every inch of road was a potential threat, every shadow a deadly signal. Joachim Piper, once confident in the precision and discipline of his armored column, now faced hesitation, fear, and chaos. The daisy chain had transformed from a physical weapon into a psychological one. German crews slowed their progress, eyes scanning ditches, rubble, and snowdrifts, unsure of what was real and what was a phantom. Even the most experienced tank commanders found themselves second-guessing every move. Lieutenant Colonel Perrin and his engineers had become masters of deception. They exploited the Germans' fear with calculated precision, alternating real chains with empty ropes, dragging harmless objects along the roads, and creating a sense that danger lurked everywhere. The enemy was paralyzed, unsure whether each step forward might trigger another devastating explosion. Every pause, every hesitation magnified the immobilization of the column, turning simple delays into catastrophic consequences. The ingenuity of the engineers extended beyond the mechanics of the daisy chain. They understood the terrain, the enemy's psychology, and the vulnerabilities of even the most formidable armored vehicles. Narrow roads, steep banks, and frozen ditches became strategic allies. The engineers waited for the perfect moment, ensuring that each mine struck with maximum effect. Their patience, courage, and precision were as lethal as the explosives themselves. The German forces were also consuming precious resources. Engines idled to prevent freezing, burning fuel at a rate that would later prove critical. The once unstoppable column now faced shortages that threatened both mobility and survival. With every hour of delay, Allied forces gained the upper hand. Fighter bombers circled overhead, striking immobile vehicles, while artillery and infantry prepared to exploit the chaos. The Germans had lost the initiative entirely, yet even as the engineers worked tirelessly, the danger remained immediate. One misstep, one exposure, and death was guaranteed. Each soldier gripping the rope faced the terrifying reality of 45-ton steel monsters rolling mere yards away. Every yank of the chain required nerve, precision, and unflinching bravery. It was a deadly game of timing and instinct, a confrontation between human ingenuity and mechanized power. By the end of the day, it was clear the daisy chain was not merely a tool, but a symbol of courage, creativity, and the power of thinking beyond conventional methods. The German forces, once confident in their technology and training, were now prisoners of their own fear. Ordinary men, engineers armed with nothing more than rope, wire, and explosives, had demonstrated that intellect, audacity, and timing could overcome even the most advanced weapons on Earth. In these frozen forests, the lesson was clear. Technology alone does not win battles. Strategy alone does not secure victory. It is courage, ingenuity, and the willingness to act when the moment is right that can change the course of history. And in the Ardennes of 1944, the 50-cent weapon had done exactly that. As the sun dipped low over the Ardennes, the consequences of the daisy-chain's success became undeniable. The German column, once a terrifying advance of King Tigers, Panthers, and fuel trucks, was now a frozen testament to the power of ingenuity. Each immobilized tank, each halted convoy, had multiplied the effect of the engineer's simple invention. The 50-cent weapon, a rope, a chain of mines, and a soldier's nerve, had not just stopped steel, it had rewritten the rules of engagement. The Germans, trapped and frustrated, could no longer rely on their technology, training, or sheer firepower. Every step became a gamble, every shadow a potential trap. Paranoia spread like wildfire, sapping confidence and slowing progress to a crawl. Even the most disciplined SS soldiers began questioning their every move, fearful that another chain could strike at any moment. The psychological toll was as destructive as the physical damage. Meanwhile, Allied forces observed and exploited the paralysis. Fighter planes, artillery, and infantry capitalized on the immobilized columns. Tanks, fuel trucks, and ammunition carriers, all trapped by fear and snow, became easy targets. The engineers' work had created both a physical blockade and a strategic advantage, buying critical time for reinforcements and counterattacks. What had started as a desperate improvisation became a decisive factor in the Battle of the Bulge. By Christmas Eve, the situation reached its inevitable conclusion. Commander Joachim Peiper, out of fuel and time, issued the devastating order, abandon ship. Radios were destroyed, guns sabotaged, and 800 surviving soldiers slipped silently into the snow-laden forest, retreating on foot into Germany. Behind them, 135 armored vehicles, the pride of the Third Reich, remained, abandoned, frozen monuments to failure. Vehicles worth hundreds of millions of dollars, capable of outfitting entire divisions, now lay inert, a testament to human ingenuity over technological supremacy. The engineers of the 291st Combat Battalion had not only stopped tanks, they had changed the course of the battle. Ordinary men, trained to build and repair rather than fight, had turned simple tools into instruments of victory. The daisy chain was more than a weapon. It was proof that courage, creativity, and precision could outmatch brute force. It was the grandfather of modern asymmetric warfare, a precursor to tactics that continue to challenge armies worldwide. In the frozen forests of Belgium, Lieutenant Colonel David Perrin and his men had achieved the extraordinary. A 50-cent rope, a few pounds of explosives, and men willing to risk everything had immobilized Germany's fine, altered the course of an offensive, and reshaped the narrative of the Battle of the Bulge. The lesson was clear. In war, brilliance can outweigh brawn, and ingenuity can triumph where raw power fails. The 50-cent weapon had done what no one expected. It had stopped 135 tanks, disrupted a powerful army, and demonstrated that even the smallest act of creativity could change history. In the end, it wasn't the mightiest tank or the best technology that won the day. It was human courage, cleverness, and the unwavering determination to act at the right moment. The aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes left a stark reminder of ingenuity's power. The German forces, humiliated and immobilized, had abandoned 135 of their most advanced armored vehicles, Panthers and King Tigers, that could have equipped entire divisions. Fuel, morale, and momentum were lost, all because ordinary men dared to think differently. Lieutenant Colonel David Perrin and his engineers had turned the tide not with overwhelming firepower, but with creativity, courage, and timing. The abandoned tanks became a monument to the failure of brute force alone. The psychological impact lingered far beyond the battlefield. German commanders, once confident in the superiority of their armor and training, were now wary, paranoid, and forced to reconsider their reliance on technology over human adaptability. Meanwhile, Allied forces seized the opportunity, advancing with newfound momentum and morale. Their success, amplified by the engineers' daring improvisation, the 50-cent weapon, the humble rope and chain of mines, would live on in history as a symbol of asymmetric warfare, proving that innovation, patience, and audacity can overcome even the most formidable opponents. In the frozen forests of Belgium, ordinary men had outsmarted one of the deadliest armies in the world, rewriting the rules of engagement, and demonstrating that in war, sometimes the smallest tools can have the largest impact. The Battle of the Bulge had been a test of technology, courage, and ingenuity. And in the end, ingenuity won. A 50-cent rope had stopped 135 tanks, reshaped a battle, and left a lesson that echoes through military history. Never underestimate the power of creativity, courage, and a well-timed idea.